let's look at it from a medical perspective. Not from somebody sitting back in a chair and saying, yes, but look what you're eating, look what you're drinking. Because that same person may be the very same person that is actually eating and drinking less than the person pointing the finger. Today it's the 15th of December 2025. My name is Professor Tess van Merwe and my speciality is obesity treatment. I have been partaking in many international debates, conferences and presentations. And what I'm hoping to achieve with a series of lectures is to get you to understand better why we call this the biggest chronic disease of the century. Because the topic is big, I've decided to present the first part called Why Am I Obese? In 3 different parts. I want you to stay with me, and therefore I don't want to overcomplicate each one of the 3 parts. So let's start by genetics. I often hear the story, Doc, but it's in my genes. Is this true? And should I throw in the towel if I carry a genetic predisposition? Well, partly yes and partly no. It is the most heritable disease on this planet Earth. It has got a heritability of close on 90%, with about 30% of the population being highly susceptible, with a conglomerate of polymorphic genes. Another 30% will be somewhat susceptible, and they basically fight obesity for the better part of their adult life. More so during critical periods like after childbirth, after menopause, when they stop exercising, when stresses and strains in life start to happen. And we'll talk about the cascade of the upregulation in the hypothalamus adrenal axis a little bit later on in the series. Then we've got 30% of people on this planet that would have a normal weight for most part of their life. Yes, they might go up 5 kilos, but when they come back from holiday, they will lose those 5 kilos very quickly. And then you have 10% of people that carry the so-called lean gene. It's polymorphic, and that basically means that a multitude of genetic abnormalities can contribute to the problems that we have with this disease called obesity. Single gene mutations are present, but they are mostly syndromic, meaning that you can recognize them rather early on, and they display very particular clinical signs that we don't have to go into for the moment. So let's come back to that statement. Doc, it's in my genes. My mother looked like that, or my father looked like that, or my grandmother looked like that. I stand no chance. Well, not really. We're living in an obesogenic environment that has made food plentiful. We don't have to forage anymore for energy. We don't climb trees anymore to get away from the enemy. We don't fight the enemy. We can survive quite comfortably, or at least in the vast majority of all the countries in the world. So food scarcity is not a reality yet. It may well become a reality somewhere in the future, but right now it's plentiful, and not necessarily the good foods that we need. And so the scale tips. You have a slight genetic susceptibility, but you go from a restrictive environment or a relatively restrictive environment that has now evolutionized into a completely obesogenic environment. That means that if you do carry a polymorphic genetic susceptibility, you have to be on your guard. You have to, from a very early age, be very careful and very mindful of what you eat and how you eat. It is, unfortunately, whether people want to hear it or not, to a large degree, it is a disease of discipline. So, how do we look at the opposite side, where we say, well, the patient has got a cluster of obese genes, polymorphic, not living in a restrictive environment. Where does that place them? Do we blame them? Or do we say, well, we're dealing with a chronic disease here that deserves more special attention? And we take the blame game out of it completely and say, let's look at it from a medical perspective. Not from somebody sitting back in a chair and saying, yes, but look what you're eating, look what you're drinking. Because that same person might be the very same person that is actually eating and drinking less than the person pointing the finger. So what is going on in our bodies that we have gone through this enormous change and challenge worldwide? Well, I think firstly we've got to understand that if they say it's in your head, it truly is in your head. The tiny gland called the hypothalamus, very complicated gland that we will dissect more carefully and step by step in the next part of this presentation, is the gatekeeper, so to speak, of many signals coming in from the body. Some of those signals are incretin signals. They come from the stomach, they come from the small intestinal tract. They can unfold in a multitude of ways to play very dynamic roles. These are also the peptides that will form the basis for many of the drugs that are currently being pushed out into the market. And yes, exciting it is, but with limitations it is as well. It is not going to be the magic bullet that everybody is hoping for. Because set against the backdrop of your genetic susceptibility, this becomes a very difficult environment to address the entire polymorphic abnormality and range of abnormalities that you may be suffering from. And that is why we have incretins where patients will have a good response in treatment, and we will have incretin treatments where the patients will walk into your office and simply say, well, I've tried this now for 2 years and it's made no difference. Of course, it's not going to make a difference because they do not carry that polymorphic genetic abnormality that is going to make a difference in the control of their weight. And so we will continue to develop these molecules until eventually we will maybe have a second and a third generation of drugs that will have a much broader application in terms of the incretin behavior. So what do we mean by incretins? The incretins is what you would commonly refer to as the semi-glutide medicines, the Mounjaros, and other new ones that are coming into the market that we will address in a little while. So that is the backdrop that we've got. We have evolved as a human species into a situation where we have a very high genetic polymorphic susceptibility, and we've got 2 treatment modalities that are playing out. On the one hand, we've got the non-invasive treatments. Those would include injections such as semaglutide, Mounjaro, and others coming through the pipeline now, coming through the third phase trials. And then we will have the invasive treatments. Why do we have to resort to invasive treatment in some of these patients? Well, the answer is almost so blatantly clear and so obvious and so strikingly right there in front of us. It is simply that the incretin-based treatments will never be enough to solve the problem. And we may have to resort to some form of malabsorption or calorie wasting in order for that patient to create a sufficient calorie deficit to make a difference and to take them forward in their progression of the treatment of obesity. So I have, in a very basic summary, got these 4 columns for you. It's a very simplified schematic representation of the neural, motivational, and behavior aspects of hedonic feeding and the inhibitory control that it is. Now, what do we mean by hedonic? Well, there are 2 pathways, and we will go into this in the next lecture. We have a homeostatic feeding mechanism, and we have a hedonic feeding mechanism. They are not related in any shape or form. They are 2 separate pathways. Hedonic meaning that in some cases people will eat to satisfy a certain stress signal, to satisfy a certain visual acuity, and they always struggle with anxiety and stress-related symptoms. They become very sad in their prognosis of this disease. And the reason for that is that the hedonic cascade will be so heavily slanted towards palatable food cues. And if we look around us in the world today, those are so multitude. They are everywhere. We are basically confronted with palatable food cues, not even on an hourly basis. If you pick up Facebook, you're almost confronted with it on a minute-to-minute basis. And that will then have very defined implications in brain areas: the prefrontal cortex, the mesolimbic dopamine system, and the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, which we will discuss later, regulating homeostatic hunger, a very specific cascade of arexogenic and anorexogenic genes. But in between that, we have the motivational processes kicking in of whether this should be inhibitory control for that person or whether that person is going to suffer from constant hedonic hunger. And I think most specialists working in the field of obesity has heard this. Doc, I don't know, I can't help myself. I've got food noise. I'm constantly hungry. I'm always on the lookout for food. And that delays the whole homeostatic cascade, and the hedonic cascade will become plentiful in its actions in the brain. So, yes, on this last slide, I will show you a very broad overview of just how complicated this is. The homeostatic cascade is basically fighting with the hedonic cascade. The homeostatic cascade will come from the liver, it will come from the gastrointestinal tract, it will come from the fat mass, it will come from muscle. It's all relayed via the vagus nerve and it goes through the nucleus tractus solitarius to right there where we don't want it, and that is the hypothalamus. And there all these signals are integrated, and it comes into clash with the hedonic acuities that you've just experienced. And the brain has to process everything that comes from the limbic system, everything that comes from the prefrontal cortex, has to integrate it, chop it up into little blocks in the hypothalamus, and kick out a signal that goes out. And that signal can be either a catabolic, meaning a satiety signal, or an anabolic signal, which means that it is not going to fulfill the need that that patient has to resist food for that moment. So, to come back to my initial question, doctor, it's all in my genes. Yes, it is all in your genes to a very large extent. But you have the ability to train yourself not to go for the hedonic clues and not to listen to all the food noise that goes with it. How are we going to do that? Well, that is a very tough road to walk. And in some cases, the incretins may help, and in some, bariatric surgery may be the solution. One way or another way, doesn't matter how you look at it, you have to tip the scale to a negative balance where your homeostatic system becomes dominant and your hedonic system becomes subservient. So stay with me and we will address the remainder of this topic in the next 2 video sessions.